I used to think the stories coming out of the Appalachian Mountains were exaggerated. You hear things growing up in America. Old mining towns where nobody stops after dark. Villages tucked deep into the hills where people still lock their doors before sunset. Not because of crime, but because of what walks the tree line. Most folks laugh it off. I did too, until I spent 3 weeks in a place called Blackwater Hollow. Now, before I go any further, I need to say something. I'm not telling you this because I want attention. Hell, I stayed quiet about it for almost 4 years. But lately, I haven't been sleeping much. And every single night, around 2:13 a.m., I keep hearing the same sound outside my apartment window. 3 knocks. Slow. Patient. Like something traveled a very long way to find me again. And if you're listening to this alone tonight, you might want to keep the lights on, because this story starts in one of those tiny Appalachian villages that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. The kind of place where people stare at you too long when you mention the wrong name. The kind of place where the woods feel alive. And the kind of place where, according to the locals, you never whistle after midnight. I learned that lesson the hard way. It started in late October of 2021. I was working freelance photography back then, driving through eastern Kentucky, documenting abandoned coal towns for a regional magazine. Most of the places I visited were exactly what you'd expect. Collapsed porches, rusted pickup trucks, churches with 10 people left attending Sunday service. Sad places, quiet places. But Blackwater Hollow was different from the moment I arrived. The road into town twisted through miles of dense forest. No gas stations, no stores, no cell signal. Just endless trees pressing close against the road like they were trying to swallow it whole. About 10 miles out, I noticed something strange. Every single mailbox along the road had a strip of red cloth tied around it. Not 1 or 2, all of them. At first, I figured maybe it was for hunting season or some local tradition. But then I realized something else. None of the houses had porch lights on, and it was already getting dark. Now, listen. I've driven through plenty of rural towns before. But when an entire village decides darkness is somehow safer than light, that'll make the hair stand up on your neck real quick. I reached Blackwater Hollow around 6:40 p.m. Tiny place, maybe 30 homes total. There was a diner, a post office, and a weather-beaten church sitting crooked on a hill overlooking the village. Most buildings looked untouched since the 70s. I parked outside the diner, hoping to grab coffee and ask around about old mining sites nearby. The second I walked in, the conversation stopped. You ever experienced that? That sudden silence when everyone notices you at once? Yeah, that. About 8 people sat inside the diner, all locals, all staring at me like I'd just wandered into somebody's funeral wearing clown shoes. Finally, an older waitress approached me. Gray hair, deep wrinkles, cigarette voice. She looked exhausted. "You passed the red markers on the road?" she asked. I nodded, and I swear to God, her face tightened. "You should have turned around." Now at this point, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded ridiculous. Like some low-budget horror movie setup. And honestly, I should have listened to my instincts right then. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially in Appalachia. I told her I was staying a few nights to photograph abandoned mining structures. She leaned closer. "Then stay out of the woods after dark." Simple enough warning, right? Except the way she said it. It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like fear. A younger guy sitting near the window finally spoke up. Probably mid-30s. Beard. Carhartt jacket. "You hear whistling at night," he said. "Don't answer it." A couple locals immediately glared at him, like he'd said something forbidden. The waitress snapped at him to shut up, and that's when I noticed something else. Every single window in that diner had heavy black curtains nailed over them. Not closed. Nailed. I asked why. Nobody answered. Instead, the waitress handed me my coffee and quietly said, "People disappear up here." Now look, I'm not proud of this next part, but instead of leaving town like a sane person, I got more interested. Because photographers are idiots. Seriously, you can tell us there's an ancient demon living in the woods, and our first response is usually, "Cool. Is there good lighting?" So, I checked into a small rental cabin about a mile outside town. The owner left the key under a flower pot with a handwritten note. "Lock doors before dark. Do not open windows. Ignore any knocking." At that point, even I started feeling uneasy. Still, I convinced myself it was local superstition. Maybe they liked messing with outsiders. That explanation worked. For about 3 hours. Around 11 p.m., I was reviewing photos when I heard the first whistle. Faint. Far away. It echoed through the trees behind the cabin. Long and low. Not musical, not human. I froze. Then it came again. Closer this time. Now, here's the thing. Nobody tells you about deep Appalachian woods at night. They are never fully silent. You hear insects, wind, branches moving. But after that whistle, everything stopped. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just dead silence. And somehow, that silence felt worse than the sound itself. I locked the cabin door and tried ignoring it. A few minutes later, something walked across the porch. Slow footsteps. Heavy, wood creaking under weight. I remember holding my breath so hard my chest hurt. Then came 3 knocks against the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Not aggressive. Almost polite. Like whoever, or whatever, stood outside already knew I was in there. I stayed completely still. Another whistle drifted through the trees. Except this one came from farther away. Meaning whatever knocked wasn't making the whistling sound. That realization hit me like ice water. Because now, there were at least 2 things outside. And then, I heard my own voice. "Hey man," it whispered from the porch. "Open up." Every muscle in my body locked. Same tone, same cadence. Exactly my voice. I know how insane that sounds. Believe me. But hearing yourself speak from outside a locked cabin in the middle of nowhere, that does something to your brain. The voice spoke again. "You forgot your camera." I looked over. My camera was sitting right beside me on the table. That's when survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned off every light in the cabin and backed into the corner, holding the fireplace poker, like that rusty thing was Excalibur itself. The knocking stopped after about 10 minutes, but I didn't sleep, not even close. Around sunrise, I drove straight back into town. The diner waitress took one look at me and knew. "You heard it," she said quietly. I asked her what was in those woods. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she poured coffee with shaking hands. Then she told me a story the locals apparently grew up hearing. Back in the mining days, entire groups of workers vanished deep in the mountains. Search parties found camps abandoned, tools scattered everywhere, but no bodies, Then people started hearing voices in the woods. Familiar voices. Family members. Friends. Sometimes dead relatives. The story spread across neighboring villages for generations. According to locals, something in those mountains learns people, mimics them, calls them into the dark. Now, if you're sitting there thinking these are just old Appalachian legends, that's exactly what I thought too. Until the waitress asked me a question I still can't answer. How did know your voice after one night? That shut me up real fast, because she was right. I hadn't spoken much since arriving. So how did it mimic me perfectly? I decided I was leaving that afternoon. Didn't care about photos anymore. Didn't care about money. I just wanted out. But before I left, the younger guy from the diner approached me outside. He looked nervous, sleep-deprived, like someone carrying around secrets too heavy for one person. He told me people in Blackwater Hollow had rules. Never whistle at night. Never follow voices into the trees. Never look directly into the woods if you hear knocking behind you. And most importantly, if someone calls your name from outside after midnight, do not answer immediately. Wait, because sometimes they'll call twice. I asked him what that meant. He just stared toward the mountains. You answer the wrong voice, he whispered. It learns you better. Then he walked away. I left town an hour later, or at least I tried to. About 5 miles outside Blackwater Hollow, my truck stalled. No warning. Engine just died. Dead battery. No signal. Middle of nowhere. Perfect. I sat there cursing under my breath while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. And then I noticed something standing between the trees. Tall. Unnaturally tall. Too thin. At first I thought it was a tree trunk, until it moved. Slowly. One step forward, then another. I locked the truck doors immediately. The figure stopped at the edge of the woods, maybe 40 yards away. And even from that distance, I could tell it wasn't right. Its arms hung too long. Its posture bent awkwardly, like it wasn't used to standing upright. Then it tilted its head, and I heard my mother's voice. Jack. Soft. Gentle. Exactly like her. My blood turned cold, because my mother was over 7,000 miles away at the time. The thing took another step forward, then smiled. I couldn't fully see the face through the trees, but I saw enough. The mouth stretched too wide, way too wide. Then came the whistle, right beside the truck. I turned sharply toward the passenger window, and something tapped the glass. 3 slow taps. I swear I nearly blacked out. There was nothing there when I looked, but the figure by the trees was suddenly closer, much closer. I grabbed the tire iron from under my seat, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't matter. Then headlights appeared behind me. A pickup truck. The younger guy from the diner pulled alongside my vehicle. He rolled down the window and shouted, "Don't look back at it." I didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He hooked chains to my truck and towed me nearly 15 miles without speaking once. When we finally reached the highway, he stopped. Before leaving, he looked me dead in the eyes and said something I think about almost every night now. It followed you because you listened. Then he drove away. I never saw Blackwater Hollow again. But here's the part that keeps me awake. 3 months after that trip, I started hearing whistling outside my apartment at night. At first, only occasionally, then more often, always around 2:13 a.m. And last winter, I heard knocking on my bedroom window, 3 slow knocks, followed by my own voice whispering from outside, "Hey man, open up." Now maybe there's a logical explanation for all this. Maybe isolation messes with the mind. Maybe Appalachian folklore gets under your skin. Or maybe some places in those mountains hold things older than the towns built around them. Things that learned long ago how to call people into the dark. And maybe the people living in those tiny forgotten villages aren't paranoid at all. Maybe they're surviving. So if you ever find yourself driving through Appalachia late at night, and you pass a village where every porch light is off, keep driving. And if you hear whistling in the woods, whatever you do, don't answer it, because sometimes it answers back. And before you go tonight, I want to ask you something. If you were trapped in Blackwater Hollow and you heard someone you loved calling your name from those woods, would you answer? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever heard strange stories coming out of Appalachia, small mountain towns, or places people avoid after dark, I'd love to read them, because the deeper I dig into these stories, the more I start thinking some legends exist for a reason. It knew my name, but the voice coming from the woods was my mother's. Why would something in the Appalachian forest imitate the most trusted voice I know? The first thing I noticed was how quiet the woods had become. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind campers post online with captions like, "Nature heals the soul." I mean the kind of silence that makes your brain start searching for danger before your eyes even know where to look. No crickets, no wind, no birds, just the soft crackling of our campfire, and 4 grown adults suddenly pretending not to notice how uncomfortable they were getting. And somewhere beyond the trees, something knocked against wood. 3 slow taps, like someone gently hitting a baseball bat against a tree trunk. Then it stopped. At the time, we still thought there was a rational explanation for everything. That's the dangerous part about Appalachia. The mountains let you believe that for a while. My name's Daniel, and this happened in eastern Kentucky back in October of 2019. There were 4 of us total. Me, my younger brother Tyler, Tyler's friend Mason, and Mason's uncle Rick, who claimed he knew those mountains better than the locals. That should have been our first warning, because people who actually know Appalachia, they don't brag about it. They respect it, especially after dark. We'd rented an old cabin about 12 miles off the nearest paved road. The listing online described it as rustic and isolated, which turned out to mean no cell signal, no nearby houses, and 1 dirt road in and out. Perfect setting for a relaxing weekend, right? Tyler loved camping. He was one of those guys who watched survival videos non-stop and thought owning a tactical flashlight counted as a personality trait. Mason mostly came because his girlfriend dumped him 2 weeks earlier. And Rick came because he wanted to hunt. He spent the entire drive talking about deer trails, black bears, and how city people panic too easy. That sentence aged horribly. The first strange thing happened before sunset. We were unloading gear near the cabin when Mason suddenly stopped carrying the cooler and stared into the woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all paused. Nothing. Then, faintly, a whistle, far away. 3 short notes, not bird-like, human. Rick immediately looked irritated. Probably hikers, but the way he said it sounded forced, like he wanted the explanation more than he believed it. Tyler laughed it off. "Relax," he said. "Worst case scenario, it's hillbillies with moonshine." Honestly, that got a laugh out of all of us, at least at the time. By nightfall, the temperature dropped hard. The fire became the only comforting thing for miles. The woods around the cabin looked impossibly black. Not dark blue, not shadowy, black, like the trees themselves were swallowing light. And that's when Rick told us the story. Apparently, locals avoided that section of forest because of disappearances going back decades. Hunters, hikers, campers, people gone without a trace. Now, obviously, every small town has stories like that. But Rick didn't tell it like some fun ghost story. He told it quietly, carefully, like he regretted bringing it up halfway through. There are places out here, he said, staring into the fire, where you hear things you shouldn't follow. Tyler rolled his eyes immediately. Oh boy, here we go. Rick ignored him. If somebody calls your name from the woods at night, he looked directly at us. Don't answer it. Silence settled over the fire. Then Mason smirked nervously. What if it sounds like somebody we know? Rick didn't smile. That's the problem. Now at this point, I still didn't believe any supernatural stuff. But I'll admit, something changed in the atmosphere after that conversation. Nobody wandered far from the fire anymore. Nobody joked as loudly. And every time the woods creaked, all four of us looked up. Around midnight, Tyler volunteered to grab more firewood from the pile near the tree line. He disappeared into the dark with a flashlight. 10 seconds later, we heard him yell. Not scream, just a sharp, startled yell. We all jumped up immediately. Tyler, no answer. Rick grabbed his rifle, and for the first time all weekend, I saw fear on his face. We hurried toward the tree line and found Tyler standing completely frozen beside the wood pile. His flashlight pointed into the forest. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I realized there was another light deeper in the woods. A flashlight, standing perfectly still between the trees, watching us. Hello, Mason called. The light instantly switched off, just gone. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. The darkness swallowed whoever was out there. Tyler laughed nervously. Okay, not funny anymore. Rick quietly told everyone to get back inside the cabin. That's when things started escalating. Inside, the cabin suddenly felt too small. Every window looked like an open invitation for something to stare back at us. Tyler kept trying to rationalize it. Probably hunters messing around. But even he sounded uncertain now. Around 1:30 in the morning, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, crunching through leaves, circling the cabin. Mason peeked through the curtains. I don't see anybody. The footsteps stopped immediately after he said that. Then came 3 knocks on the cabin wall. Not the door, the wall. Knock, knock, knock. Nobody moved. I remember hearing the fire in the stove crackle, while all 4 of us just stared at each other. Then Tyler whispered, "Tell me that was a branch." Another knock answered him. Closer this time, from the back of the cabin. Rick chambered around into the rifle. And that sound, that metallic click, somehow made everything worse, because now the situation felt real. Nobody slept that night. At around 3 a.m., Mason finally muttered that he needed the bathroom. The cabin's plumbing barely worked, so the bathroom was basically an outhouse 20 feet away. Nobody wanted him going alone, but nobody wanted to go with him either. Eventually, Tyler volunteered. The 2 of them stepped outside carrying flashlights. The door shut behind them, and for about 30 seconds, everything was quiet. Then Tyler screamed, not startled, not surprised, terrified, We burst outside immediately. Their flashlights were shaking wildly near the outhouse. "What happened?" I shouted. Tyler couldn't answer. Mason pointed toward the woods. There was someone standing there. Where? Right there. But there was nobody now, just trees. Then we noticed the smell. Rotting. Like wet earth mixed with something dead. Rick scanned the darkness with the rifle. "You boys get inside. Now." Nobody argued anymore. Back inside the cabin, Tyler finally explained what he saw. He claimed there was a person standing just beyond the trees. Tall, too tall. And according to him, it smiled when the flashlight hit its face. Not a normal smile, a stretched, unnatural grin. Now listen, I know how this sounds. Sleep deprivation, fear, darkness playing tricks on people. That's exactly what I kept telling myself, until the voice started. Around 4 a.m., somebody outside softly said my name. "Daniel." Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. The voice sounded exactly like my mother. Not similar, exact. Same softness, same tone. Coming from outside the cabin window. "Daniel." Tyler heard it too, because his face immediately lost color. Rick slowly shook his head at us, warning us not to respond. The voice moved along the side of the cabin. Then it spoke again. Closer. "It's cold out here." Mason started crying. Not loudly, just silent, terrified tears running down his face. And honestly, I wasn't far behind him, because deep down, every single one of us understood something horrifying in that moment. Whatever was outside was trying to lure us out. Then came the scratching, long, slow scraping across the cabin walls, like fingernails dragging over wood, back and forth, back and forth. The sound lasted nearly 20 minutes. At some point, Tyler whispered, "What if it gets inside?" Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. Eventually dawn finally started bleeding through the windows. Gray light filtered into the trees, and the sounds stopped. Just stopped, completely. The silence afterward felt almost worse. Rick waited another hour before opening the cabin door. The forest looked normal again. Birds chirping, wind moving branches, morning sunlight everywhere. Like the mountain was pretending none of it happened. We packed our things faster than I've ever packed anything in my life. Nobody talked much. We just wanted out. But right before leaving, Mason noticed something beside the cabin. Marks in the dirt, footprints, except they didn't look human. They were long, misshapen, and impossibly deep, like whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. The tracks circled the entire cabin, over and over and over, then disappeared directly into the woods. Tyler kept trying to joke during the drive home. You know that nervous humor people use when they're close to panicking. At one point he laughed and said, "Well, at least we saved money on a haunted house attraction." Nobody laughed, especially Rick, because Rick looked genuinely disturbed now. About halfway home, he finally spoke, quietly. "There's a reason locals don't whistle in those mountains." Mason stared at him. "What does whistling mean?" Rick hesitated, then said something I still think about constantly. "In Appalachia, if you hear whistling at night," he looked out the truck window, "you're supposed to pray it's human." After that trip, Tyler stopped camping entirely. Mason moved to Florida 6 months later and refuses to discuss that weekend. And Rick sold his hunting property in Kentucky less than a year afterward. As for me, I still wake up sometimes hearing that voice outside the cabin window, soft, patient, pretending to be someone I trust. And the worst part, there's one detail I never told the others. That final morning, while we were loading the truck, I looked back toward the trees one last time, and for just a second, I saw someone standing between them, watching us leave. Tall, unmoving, smiling. Jacob Turner had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for almost 5 years, but nothing in all those years could explain what happened to him near Nantahala National Forest during the fall of 2024. At 27 years old, Jacob loved hiking alone. He liked the silence of the mountains, the cold air, and the feeling of being far away from cities and people. He had already completed many sections of the Appalachian Trail and believed he understood the wilderness better than most people. But there are places in the Appalachian Mountains that even experienced hikers avoid. Places locals refuse to talk about after dark. And Jacob unknowingly walked into one of them. It started on a cloudy October morning. The forest was cold and wet from rain the night before. Thick fog moved slowly through the trees, and the mountains around him looked almost black under the dark sky. Jacob had been hiking since sunrise. Around noon, while stopping for water near a rocky slope, he noticed something strange beside the trail, a narrow path. It was hidden behind thick bushes and hard to notice unless someone was looking carefully. The path looked old and unused, but not completely abandoned. Near the entrance stood a large dead tree with deep marks cut into the bark. 3 long scratches crossed by a circle. Jacob had never seen that symbol before. At first, he ignored it, but then he remembered something he had read months earlier on an online hiking forum. Someone had mentioned an abandoned settlement hidden somewhere deep in Nantahala Forest. According to the post, strange things happened there. People claimed to hear voices, see lights moving through the trees at night, and sometimes disappear for hours without explanation. Most people online laughed at the story, but a few hikers said the place was real. Jacob had always loved old Appalachian history. He thought maybe he had finally found the hidden location people talked about. So against his better judgment, he stepped off the main trail and followed the narrow path into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. The path moved downhill through thick forest. Fallen leaves covered the ground, and old trees twisted high above him. But after about 20 minutes, Jacob noticed how quiet everything had become. Too quiet. There were no birds singing, no squirrels moving through branches, no insects, nothing. Even the wind had stopped. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. Jacob slowed his pace. Something about the place made him nervous, though he could not explain why. The deeper he went, the darker the forest became. The trees grew closer together, blocking most of the daylight. Thick roots crossed the ground like giant snakes, and fog moved slowly between the trunks. Then Jacob heard it, a voice, very faint. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, someone whispering. He stopped walking immediately. The whisper came from somewhere ahead of him. He could not understand the words, but it sounded human. "Hello," Jacob shouted. The whispering stopped. Silence again. Jacob waited several seconds, then laughed nervously to himself. Probably another hiker, he thought. He continued walking. A few minutes later, the whispering returned. This time, there were multiple voices, low and quiet, like several people talking far away. Jacob could not understand what they were saying, but something about the sound made his stomach tighten. The voices did not sound normal. They sounded old, He kept moving carefully down the path until he finally reached a small open area deep inside the valley. And that was when he saw the ruins. Broken stone walls, collapsed wooden buildings, rusted farming tools sticking out of the ground. It looked like an entire village had once existed there before being swallowed by the forest. Jacob slowly walked through the ruins, looking around in disbelief. Whoever had lived there had been gone for a very long time. Most of the buildings had collapsed completely. Moss covered the stones, and small trees now grew through the floors of old cabins. But something about the place felt wrong. The damage did not look natural. Several buildings looked burned. Black marks stained the remaining stone chimneys. And in the center of the settlement stood something that made Jacob freeze. A row of small mounds in the ground. Graves, at least 15 of them. None had names. None had crosses. Just rough piles of dirt and stone. Jacob suddenly heard the whispering again, but this time it was much closer. Right behind him. He spun around quickly. Nobody was there. Then a man's voice clearly spoke from somewhere in the trees. "You shouldn't be here." Jacob's heart started pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer. Then another voice spoke. A woman this time. "They need to leave." A child began crying somewhere deep in the woods. Jacob backed away slowly. The voices continued. "They came at night. They burned us alive. They locked the doors." Jacob felt cold all over. Every hair on his arm stood up. The voices sounded completely real. But the forest around him was empty. Then he noticed something even worse. The temperature had suddenly dropped. His breath became visible in the air, and a strange smell filled the valley. Smoke, wet dirt, and blood. Old blood. Jacob grabbed his backpack and started walking quickly back toward the trail. But after several minutes, he realized something terrifying. The path was gone. No matter where he turned, he only saw trees and fog. The forest no longer looked familiar. Panic started building in his chest. He pulled out his phone. No signal. His GPS would not load. Even worse, his compass spun wildly in circles. That was when the voices became louder. Now they surrounded him from every direction. Dozens of people speaking at once. Some crying, some screaming, some whispering directly into his ears. "You can't leave. Stay with us. Don't let him escape." Jacob started running. Branches hit his face as he pushed through the woods. He slipped down muddy hills, crashed through bushes, and kept moving as fast as possible. Behind him, footsteps followed, slow at first, then faster. Crunch, 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 like several people walking through dead leaves behind him. Jacob looked back for only a second and immediately wished he hadn't. Shapes moved between the trees, human shapes. Tall, dark figures standing silently in the fog. Some looked burned black. Others looked twisted and broken. One of them looked like a little girl holding someone's hand, but the person beside her had no face. Jacob turned forward again and ran harder than he ever had in his life. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same, and the voices kept getting closer. Then suddenly, everything went silent. Completely silent. Jacob stopped running and looked around carefully. The fog around him had grown thick. So thick, he could barely see a few feet ahead. That was when he noticed the lantern. A dim orange light glowing between the trees. Someone was standing there holding it. An old woman. She wore dark clothes that looked very old-fashioned, almost from another century. Her face looked pale and tired. She stared directly at Jacob. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman slowly raised one hand and pointed behind him. "Run," she whispered. Jacob heard screaming explode through the forest. Not human screaming. Something much worse. The old woman suddenly vanished into the fog, and dark figures began moving rapidly between the trees around him. Jacob ran again. This time, the forest around him seemed alive. Branches moved on their own. Whispers came from every direction. Several times, he thought he felt hands touching his backpack and jacket from behind. Then finally, he saw the Appalachian Trail marker nailed to a tree ahead. Jacob nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled back onto the main trail, just as rain started pouring from the sky. And then something terrifying happened. All the voices stopped instantly, as if whatever had followed him could not cross back onto the trail. Jacob looked behind him one last time. Far back in the trees, dozens of pale figures stood silently watching him. Then the fog swallowed them whole. Jacob made it to a ranger station late that night, exhausted and covered in cuts and mud. He tried explaining what happened, but the rangers blamed dehydration and fear. Still shaken, Jacob later searched local historical records online. What he found made his blood run cold. In 1893, a small isolated community deep inside Nantahala Forest disappeared after a fire destroyed the settlement. According to newspaper reports, nearly everyone died. The strange part was what witnesses claimed afterward. Several rescue workers reported hearing voices in the woods. Others claimed they saw people standing between trees at night, even though the entire village had burned down. Eventually, the area was abandoned completely. Locals began calling it the Lost Hollow, and over time, maps stopped showing the settlement entirely. Jacob never returned to Nantahala National Forest, but even now, almost 2 years later, he still wakes up some nights hearing faint whispers outside his bedroom window. And sometimes, just before the whispers disappear, he hears the same warning spoken softly in the dark. "You should have stayed away." The first scream came from inside the tunnel at exactly 1:14 a.m. Not a grown man, not an animal, a little girl. And the worst part, Caleb Mercer had checked that abandoned mine himself earlier that evening. It was empty, completely empty. Caleb Mercer had spent most of his life outdoors. At 21 years old, he worked as a volunteer guide for a youth hiking program in eastern Tennessee and had more backcountry experience than most adults twice his age. He knew how to navigate difficult terrain, build shelter in heavy rain, and stay calm when things went wrong in the wilderness. That was exactly why the Knoxville Outdoor Club asked him to scout a section of trail near the abandoned mining areas outside Frozen Head State Park before bringing a group of teenagers there for a weekend expedition. The assignment sounded simple: check campsite conditions, mark water sources, look for hazards. Caleb expected 3 quiet days in the mountains. Instead, he found something waiting beneath them. He arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon in October of 2023. The forest around Frozen Head was already covered in deep orange and red leaves, and the mountains were wrapped in a heavy gray fog that never fully lifted throughout the day. By sunset, Caleb had reached an isolated clearing nearly 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. The area had once been used during Tennessee's coal mining days decades earlier, and traces of that history still remained. Rusting metal rails disappeared into the trees. Broken machinery sat half buried in the dirt, and about 200 yards uphill from his campsite, was an old mine entrance sealed with rotting wooden boards. Before setting up camp, Caleb walked over to inspect it. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and smelled like wet stone and old earth. He shined his flashlight through gaps in the wood and could only see about 20 feet inside before the darkness swallowed the beam completely. No footprints, no fresh damage, no signs anyone had been there recently. Satisfied it was safe enough to avoid, he headed back to camp. The first few hours passed normally. He cooked dinner over a small stove, wrote notes for the hiking club, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Then, a little after 1 a.m., he woke suddenly to the sound of singing, soft, faint, a child's voice somewhere in the forest. At first, Caleb thought he was dreaming, but then the singing came again. A little girl humming what sounded like an old church hymn. The sound drifted through the trees from uphill, from the direction of the mine. Caleb sat upright inside his tent, listening carefully. The voice stopped. Silence covered the woods for several seconds. Then came a single sentence. "Can somebody help me?" Caleb's stomach tightened immediately. No child should have been anywhere near that area, especially not at 1 in the morning. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The forest felt wrong the second he entered it. No insects, no owls, no wind. Just complete silence, broken only by the distant sound of the girl softly crying somewhere uphill. Caleb followed the voice carefully through the darkness until he reached the abandoned mine entrance again. The crying was coming from inside. "Hello," Caleb called out. No answer. Then the girl whispered, "He won't let me leave." The words echoed unnaturally through the tunnel. Caleb moved closer and shined his flashlight between the broken wooden boards. That was when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed deep into the mud, leading directly into the mine. Every instinct told him to leave, but another part of him kept thinking the same thing. What if a child really was trapped in there? He pulled away 2 loose boards and stepped inside. The air immediately became freezing cold. The tunnel stretched deep into the mountain, supported by old timber beams blackened with age and moisture. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling somewhere ahead, and deeper inside the darkness. The girl continued crying. Caleb followed the sound for several minutes until the tunnel opened into a larger underground chamber. That was when the singing stopped completely. His flashlight swept across the room. Old mining carts, collapsed supports, rusting tools. Then the beam landed on the far wall, and Caleb froze. Written across the stone in faded white paint were dozens of names, missing people. Some dated back to the 1970s, others much newer, and at the very bottom of the wall, his own name, Caleb Mercer, paint still wet. A sudden voice whispered directly behind him, "You came down here alone." Caleb spun around. A man stood at the edge of the darkness, tall, thin, covered in coal dust. His face looked almost melted into shadow, but his smile was visible. Too wide, too still. The man tilted his head slowly. "You heard her too." Caleb backed away immediately. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure ignored the question. Instead, it pointed deeper into the mine. "That's where the others are." Then Caleb heard it. Not one child. Dozens, crying, whispering, begging for help from somewhere far below the mountain. His flashlight began flickering violently. The temperature dropped even lower, and suddenly, the man standing before him wasn't alone anymore. Shapes emerged from the darkness around the chamber. Human figures coated in black dust, some missing eyes, some with twisted limbs, all silently watching him. Caleb turned and ran. The mine behind him erupted with sounds, footsteps, screaming, metal dragging across stone, something massive moving beneath the tunnel floor. The child's voice changed completely. No longer innocent, now angry. "Don't leave us here." Caleb sprinted through the collapsing tunnel as beams cracked overhead. He could hear the figures chasing him through the darkness just behind him, their footsteps echoing unnaturally fast. Then suddenly, fresh air, moonlight. He burst out of the mine entrance and crashed into the leaves outside. Behind him, the tunnel fell silent instantly. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Shaking violently, Caleb grabbed his gear and hiked out before sunrise without stopping once. When he finally reached the ranger station later that morning, he asked about the abandoned mine near his campsite. The ranger's expression changed immediately. He told Caleb the mine had been permanently closed after a cave-in in 1986. 7 miners had died underground. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the years, several hikers had reported hearing children crying near the tunnels late at night. 2 people had gone missing after entering the mine. Neither body was ever recovered. Caleb never returned to Frozen Head State Park. But months later, while unpacking his backpack at home, he found something buried inside one of the side pockets. A small chunk of coal, wrapped in faded paper, and written across it in shaky handwriting were 4 words. "You heard us too." Eli Mercer loved exploring forgotten places. At 26 years old, he spent most of his time hiking through the Appalachian Mountains, taking photos of abandoned towns, old churches, and places people had stopped talking about years ago. For almost 4 years, Eli traveled different parts of the Appalachian Trail, searching for places hidden deep in the woods. But in November of 2024, he found a place that should have stayed hidden forever. And according to people living near Damascus, Virginia, some places in the mountains never really disappear. They wait. Eli arrived in Damascus late on a cold Thursday evening. The town looked quiet and normal. Small diners, old shops, hikers stopping for supplies before getting back on the trail. Eli checked into a cheap motel and spent the night looking at maps on his laptop. A few weeks earlier, someone had sent him an email about an abandoned settlement hidden near Iron Mountain Trail. The person claimed hikers sometimes found old stone buildings deep in the forest, but the place didn't exist on any official map. The email also included blurry photos, broken cabins, an old church bell, and one picture that really bothered Eli. It showed a small cemetery. Every gravestone was broken, except one. That single grave marker said, "Don't answer them after dark." No name, no date, just those words. Eli couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, he packed his camera gear and drove toward the Iron Mountain section of the Appalachian Trail. The sky was gray, and thick clouds covered the mountains. At a small gas station, an older man warned Eli about bad weather coming later that night. Then the man asked, "You hiking up there alone?" Eli nodded. The man stayed quiet for a second before speaking again. "If you hear somebody calling your name out there..." He stopped. Eli waited for him to finish. The old man looked nervous. Then he quietly said, "Make sure you know who's calling." The hike started normally. Dead leaves covered the trail, and cold air moved through the trees as Eli walked deeper into the mountains. Around noon, he noticed something strange. A wooden trail marker nailed to a tree, but it wasn't an official trail sign. The wood looked old and burned around the edges. Carved into it was a strange symbol. 3 circles connected by one straight line. Under the symbol were faded words. Hollow Creek Settlement. Eli checked his map. The place wasn't there. That should have been enough reason to leave. Instead, he followed the narrow path leading away from the main trail. At first, the trail looked abandoned, but after 20 minutes, Eli noticed something strange. The path was too clean. Broken branches, fresh footprints, leaves pushed aside recently. Something had been moving through these woods. Then he saw the footprints clearly. Bare human footprints. In the cold of November, pressed deep into the mud, leading downhill. Eli raised his voice, expecting a response from somewhere deeper in the trees. But the forest felt wrong. The usual sounds of the mountains had vanished completely. No rustling leaves, no distant animal movement, not even the creaking of branches overhead. It was the kind of unnatural stillness that made him suddenly aware of how alone he really was. About an hour later, Eli reached the hollow. The place looked unreal. Old stone foundations covered the ground. Broken cabins leaned sideways under thick vines and moss. Rusted tools lay half buried in the dirt. It looked like people had disappeared in the middle of their lives. At the center of the settlement stood a church, or what was left of one. The roof had partly collapsed, and black wooden beams stuck up into the sky. Eli slowly lifted his camera. Then he heard a voice. "Help me." It sounded like a woman. Very faint. Very far away. Eli froze. "Hello," he shouted. No answer. Then the voice came again.
Help me!
"Please, help me." This time it sounded closer. Coming from inside the church, every part of Eli wanted to leave, but curiosity pulled him forward. He slowly walked toward the church. The front doors hung open. Inside smelled damp and rotten. Broken benches covered the floor. Old books lay scattered everywhere. And near the front of the church, someone was standing there. A woman, facing away from him. Long dark hair, thin white dress, bare feet covered in mud. Eli felt his stomach tighten. "Are you okay?" he asked. The woman didn't move, didn't answer. Then slowly, she pointed toward a basement door beside the altar. The door stood open. Darkness filled the stairs below, and from underneath, voices. Lots of voices, whispering together. Eli couldn't understand the words, but they sounded scared. Then the woman finally spoke. "They're still down there." Her voice sounded strange, like several people speaking at once. Eli slowly stepped backward. The woman tilted her head. "You came after dark." Then she started turning toward him. Eli never fully saw her face, because the second she moved, the whispers below the church stopped. Complete silence. Then something huge moved under the floor. A loud scraping sound echoed beneath him, like claws dragging across stone. Eli ran. He burst outside into heavy rain. The storm had started suddenly. Behind him, the church bell began ringing loudly, again and again, even though there was no bell in the tower anymore. The sound echoed through the mountains. Then the screaming started. Not whispers, real screams. Dozens of people screaming from underneath the church. Eli ran between the broken buildings, slipping through mud and wet grass. Then he saw lights in the trees, lanterns, several of them, moving slowly through the forest around him. Tall figures stepped out from the darkness, carrying old oil lanterns. At first, Eli thought they were people searching for him. Then lightning flashed, and he realized something was wrong. The figures moved strangely, jerky movements like puppets. One figure lifted its lantern. Its face looked burned black. Its eyes were completely white. Eli stumbled backward. Then the figure spoke, but the voice sounded exactly like Eli. "You shouldn't have answered." Suddenly, all the lanterns went dark. Everything around him disappeared into darkness. Eli ran uphill through the forest. Rain slammed against the trees. Branches scratched his arms and face. Several times he heard footsteps behind him, matching his speed perfectly. But every time he looked back, nothing was there. Then his flashlight died. Darkness covered everything, and somewhere nearby, he heard his own voice whisper, "Eli." He froze. The voice came again, closer this time. "Eli, over here." It sounded exactly like him. Then another voice joined in, a woman crying softly, "Please don't leave us down there." Soon dozens of voices started repeating his name from every direction in the woods. Eli ran harder than he ever had in his life. Then suddenly, he burst back onto the Appalachian Trail. Moonlight shined through the clouds. The storm was gone. No rain, no wind, nothing. Eli turned around. The path leading to the settlement had disappeared. Only thick forest remained. No trail, no opening, nothing. By sunrise, Eli finally made it back to Damascus, covered in mud, shaking badly. The motel owner looked shocked when he saw him. "Where the hell have you been?" Eli frowned. "What are you talking about? You checked out 3 days ago." Eli felt sick. 3 days. That couldn't be possible. He had only entered the hollow yesterday afternoon. The motel owner looked worried. "We almost called search and rescue." Eli quickly checked his camera. Most of the photos were ruined. Only static covered the screen, except for one image, a photo taken inside the church. At first it looked blurry. Then Eli zoomed in. The woman near the altar wasn't alone. Hundreds of faces stared out from the darkness below the floorboards. Men, women, children, burned faces, crying faces, reaching upward. And in the corner of the photo stood another figure, tall, burned skin, white eyes, holding a lantern. Eli deleted the photo immediately. But sometimes, late at night, the image still appears on his phone for a split second before disappearing again. Months later, Eli finally learned the truth about Hollow Creek settlement. Old records in Bristol, Tennessee told the story. In 1911, a fire destroyed a small religious community hidden near Iron Mountain. Official reports blamed the fire on an accident during a storm. But local stories said something much worse happened. People believed the preacher of the church had gone insane. He convinced the people living there that the end of the world was coming. One night, during a church service, he locked everyone inside the building. Then he burned it down. Nobody survived. After that, hikers started reporting strange things in the area. Voices calling from the woods, lantern lights moving through trees at night, people hearing family members calling their names from deep in the forest. Eventually, the settlement disappeared from maps completely. Like somebody wanted the place erased. Eli never went back to Iron Mountain. He stopped exploring abandoned places forever. Friends noticed he changed after that trip. He barely talks anymore. He keeps blackout curtains over every window in his apartment. And no matter what happens, he never answers voices at night. Because sometimes, right before he falls asleep, he still hears something calling his name from deep inside the mountains. using his own voice. 3 years ago, I made the mistake of driving the entire length of the Blue Ridge Parkway alone during late October. At the time, I was 31 years old and working as a freelance photographer based out of Nashville. I specialized in landscape photography, especially abandoned places and remote wilderness areas. That fall, I had been hired to create a photo series covering isolated mountain communities throughout Western Virginia. I thought it would be peaceful. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The Blue Ridge Parkway feels different once the sun starts going down. During the day, it is beautiful. Endless forests painted orange and red, old mountains rolling beneath layers of fog, quiet little overlooks where tourists stop to take pictures. But at night, those mountains feel ancient, not old, ancient, like something in them has been watching people long before roads were ever carved through the hills. I had spent most of the afternoon taking photos near an isolated overlook about 40 miles north of Roanoke. By the time I packed my gear, heavy fog had started moving through the valleys below. That was when I realized my car would not start. At first, I assumed the battery was dead, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. No clicking, no lights, completely dead. And of course, I had no phone signal. I remember standing there in the cold wind, staring at the empty road, thinking how strange it was that I had not seen another car in almost an hour. Then I heard someone whistle behind me. I turned and saw an older man standing near the tree line. I still do not know how long he had been watching me. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing muddy work boots, a brown hunting jacket, and a faded camouflage cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered like old leather, and he carried a flashlight, even though there was still some daylight left. "You broke down?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I told him my battery was dead and asked if there was a ranger station nearby. He smiled a little and said, "No ranger stations out here. Closest help's about 20 miles south." Then he introduced himself as Earl. Earl said he lived nearby, up in the holler with his nephews, and offered to help tow my car after dark once they brought their truck. Something about him immediately made me uneasy. Not because he looked threatening, because he looked completely unsurprised to find me stranded there, like he had expected someone to eventually stop. Still, I did not have many options. The temperature was dropping fast, and the fog was getting thicker every minute. Earl told me there was an old service cabin nearby where I could stay warm until his nephews arrived. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We walked off the roadside and into the woods. At first, there actually was a visible trail, narrow, overgrown, probably used by maintenance workers years ago. But after 15 minutes, the trail disappeared completely. I asked Earl if we were close. He did not answer right away. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. Folks from the city always think these mountains are empty. The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just our footsteps crunching across dead leaves. Then I noticed lights moving through the trees ahead of us. Flashlights, at least 3 of them. Earl stopped walking and smiled without looking back at me. Told my boys to come meet us. Every survival instinct in my body started screaming. I immediately told him I wanted to go back to the road. Earl slowly turned around, and for the first time, the friendly expression disappeared from his face completely. "You ain't gonna find that road again by yourself," he said quietly. That was the moment I knew I was in real danger. I backed away slowly, while the lights ahead kept getting closer between the trees. Then, somewhere off to my right, I heard another whistle answer from the darkness. They had surrounded me. I dropped my camera bag and ran. Branches tore across my face as I sprinted blindly downhill through the forest. Behind me, I could hear shouting and heavy footsteps crashing through the woods. But the worst part was how calm they sounded. Nobody was yelling in panic. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded practiced, like this was something they had done before. I fell twice running down the mountain. The second time, I slammed into a creek bed, hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs. That probably saved my life, because while I was lying there trying to breathe, I noticed something through the trees below me. Headlights, a road. I scrambled downhill toward it as fast as I could, while the flashlight beams behind me bounced closer through the woods. When I burst out onto the pavement, I nearly got hit by a passing pickup truck. The driver stopped immediately after seeing the state I was in, covered in mud, bleeding from my hands, barely able to talk. He drove me straight to the sheriff's office in a nearby mountain town. When I described Earl to the deputy, his expression changed instantly. He asked me one question. Did he mention family living in the hollers? I said yes. The deputy leaned back in his chair and went completely quiet for a few seconds. Then he told me there had been multiple disappearances along isolated sections of the parkway over the last decade. Mostly travelers, mostly people alone. A few abandoned vehicles had been recovered, but the people were never found. According to locals, there were families deep in those mountains who avoided outsiders completely and protected their territory violently. The sheriff's department had investigated for years, but nobody could ever prove anything. No bodies, no witnesses willing to testify. Nothing. Before I left, the deputy told me something I still think about all the time. He said, "Out here, getting lost ain't always the thing you should fear most." I have not driven remote mountain roads alone since that night, and every time I see fog rolling through the hills, I remember those flashlights moving silently between the trees. Still searching. My name is Claire Bennett, and 2 winters ago, I inherited a fire lookout tower deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee after my uncle died. Until then, I did not even know my family owned property there. I was living in Savannah at the time, working remote tech support and barely speaking to anyone in my family besides my mother. When the lawyer handling my uncle's estate called me, he sounded genuinely confused that the tower had been left to me specifically. According to him, my uncle had changed his will just 6 weeks before his death. The property sat somewhere near an abandoned logging settlement outside Elizabethton, accessible only by an old forestry road that was apparently closed during heavy snow. The lawyer strongly suggested selling it. Most folks around there avoid that mountain entirely, he told me. At the time, I assumed he meant because it was isolated. I know now that was not what he meant. The drive into the mountains took almost 9 hours. Once I left the highway, the roads became narrow and twisted through endless black pine forest. Every small town I passed looked frozen in time. Rusted gas pumps, collapsing churches, old men sitting silently outside convenience stores, watching traffic pass. The last gas station before the mountain was a tiny place called Mercer's Market. When I mentioned the name of the mountain to the cashier, her entire expression changed. "You headed up to Black Hollow Ridge?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She stared at me for several seconds before saying something I still think about constantly. "If you hear knocking after dark, don't answer it." Then she refused to say anything else. By the time I reached the forestry road, snow had already started falling. The lookout tower stood alone near the summit, rising above the trees on rusted steel supports. It looked abandoned at first glance, but when I climbed the stairs, I realized someone had maintained it recently. The lock had been replaced, the windows were clean, and there was fresh firewood stacked beside the door. Inside, the tower was small, but surprisingly warm. There was a cot, an old propane stove, shelves full of canned food, and dozens of notebooks stacked neatly beside a radio set that no longer worked. Most of the notebooks belonged to my uncle. At first, they seemed like ordinary journals about weather patterns and wildlife sightings. Then I found the entries about the sounds. According to my uncle, strange knocking noises echoed through the mountains almost every night after sunset. 3 knocks meant it was far away. 2 knocks meant it was moving closer. 1 knock meant you needed to turn off every light immediately and stay silent. I laughed when I first read that. My uncle had apparently spent decades alone in a mountain tower and slowly lost his mind. That night, around 1 a.m., I heard the first knock. It came from somewhere deep in the forest below the tower. A single heavy impact, like someone striking a tree with a giant hammer. About 30 seconds later, another knock answered from farther up the ridge. Then another. The sounds slowly circled the mountain. I'd remember standing by the window, trying to locate where they were coming from, when the radio beside the bed suddenly crackled to life. At first, it was only static. Then I heard a voice. "Turn off the light." The voice sounded exactly like my uncle. I froze. The radio crackled again. "Claire, turn off the light." That was when something moved between the trees below the tower. It was tall, far too tall to be human. I could only see pieces of it moving through the snowfall, but every time the moonlight hit it, I saw pale skin stretched tightly over impossibly long limbs. Then came another knock, this time directly beneath the tower. The entire structure vibrated. I shut off the lantern instantly. For the next hour, I listened to something circling below me in the darkness. Heavy footsteps in the snow, metal creaking beneath the tower, and every few minutes, another knock. Around dawn, the sounds finally stopped. I packed my things and left immediately. Halfway down the mountain, I noticed something carved into one of the trees beside the road. Tallies, hundreds of them, and beneath the marks, carved deeply into the bark, were 5 words. "It only comes to light." When I reached Mercer's Market again, I asked the cashier how long my uncle had lived on Black Hollow Ridge. She looked at me strangely. "Honey," she said quietly, "your uncle disappeared up there in 1998. According to the sheriff's department, nobody had seen him in almost 25 years. But somebody had been stacking fresh firewood beside that tower. And whatever was knocking in those mountains still knew my name. I had been walking for 6 hours when I found the cabin. No path leading to it. No signs. Just a structure sitting in the hollow between 2 ridges on Roan Mountain. Like it had always been there. Like it was waiting. I had one rule: never shelter in an abandoned building overnight. But the storm coming down the ridge gave me no choice. I went inside, The cabin was old, maybe 100 years, maybe more. Pine walls dark with moisture, a single iron stove in the corner, 2 wooden chairs facing the window, a table with something carved into the surface. I couldn't make it out in the fading light. I dropped my pack, started a fire. That's when I noticed the door on the far wall, boarded up, not with old rotting wood, with fresh planks, recently nailed. Someone had been here, recently, and they had sealed that door like they meant it. I told myself it was just a storage room, a root cellar. I had no reason to open it. The storm hit hard around midnight, thunder rolling down the ridge like something enormous moving through the trees. I sat by the stove, half asleep. Then I heard it. Knocking, not from the front door, from behind the boarded wall. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. My chest tightened. I told myself it was wind, old wood expanding. I told myself a lot of things that night. Then the knocking stopped, and a voice came through, low, barely audible, like someone with their mouth pressed flat against the wood. Don't open it. I stood up, backed against the far wall, my hands shaking. Don't open it. They're watching. I wanted to speak. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely. The fire went out. Darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight. Found it. Clicked it on. The beam swept across the room. The 2 chairs by the window. They had moved. Both facing inward now. Facing the boarded door. Like someone had arranged them. Like someone was sitting in them. Waiting. Watching that door with me. I grabbed my pack. Moved to the front door. Pulled it open. Rain hit me like a wall. I ran. Didn't stop until I reached the main trail. Didn't look back. I reported it to the ranger station at Carver's Gap the next morning. The ranger listened. Didn't write anything down. Just looked at me for a long moment. Which hollow? He asked. I described the location, the 2 ridges, the iron stove. He nodded slowly. We know that cabin, he said. We've boarded that back door 4 times. He paused. Every time we come back, the boards are stacked neatly outside. No tools, no damage, just removed. He looked back at his desk, like the conversation was over. We don't send anyone up there past dark anymore. He didn't explain what was behind the door. I didn't ask. Some things in these mountains don't get explained. They just wait. I grew up hearing about Black Pine Gap long before I ever saw it. It wasn't a town exactly, more like a forgotten stretch of valley tucked between 2 ridges in eastern Tennessee. There were maybe 30 houses scattered along the hollow, a small church, a volunteer fire station, and a gas station that seemed permanently stuck in 1997. Most people passed through without noticing it existed. The locals preferred it that way. My grandfather lived there his entire life. He knew every family, every dirt road, every abandoned logging trail hidden in the mountains. When I was a kid, he used to tell stories while sitting on his porch in the evenings. Stories about floods, stories about coal camps, stories about moonshiners. But there was one place he never liked discussing. A place called Old Widow Road. The road wasn't really a road anymore. It had once connected Black Pine Gap to another community on the far side of the mountain. Decades ago, a landslide destroyed part of it. The county built a new highway route and abandoned the old one. Nature moved in quickly. Trees grew through cracks in the pavement. Brush swallowed entire sections. Eventually, the road became little more than a scar winding through the forest. Whenever I asked my grandfather about it, he always gave the same answer. Don't go up there after sunset. That was it. No explanation. No ghost stories, no dramatic warnings, just those 6 words. As a teenager, I assumed it was local superstition. Every Appalachian town seemed to have a road people avoided. Old Widow Road was ours. Years passed. I moved away. College, work, marriage, life happened. Then, when I was 33, my grandfather passed away. I returned to Black Pine Gap for the funeral. After everything was over, I stayed an extra week to help my grandmother around the property. One evening, while cleaning out an old storage shed, I found a faded photograph. The picture showed my grandfather standing beside a pickup truck sometime in the late 1970s. Behind him was a rusted road sign, Old Widow Road. I stared at it for a long time. Later that night, curiosity finally got the better of me. I asked my grandmother why Grandpa hated that road. She looked up from her coffee. For a moment, I thought she might answer. Instead, she simply said, "Because he went up there once after dark." Then she changed the subject. That answer bothered me. The next afternoon, I drove out to see the place myself. The entrance was easy to find, a narrow opening between 2 walls of forest. The old pavement was still visible beneath decades of leaves. It looked abandoned, harmless. I parked and walked a short distance. Birds sang overhead. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Nothing felt unusual. I almost laughed at myself. This was the road people feared. I turned around and headed back. Then I noticed something strange. There were no animal tracks. Not a single one. No deer prints. No raccoon tracks. Nothing. For nearly half a mile, the soft dirt beside the road was completely untouched. At the time, I dismissed it. Looking back, I shouldn't have. That evening, I mentioned the missing tracks to a local man named Harold Baker. Harold was in his 70s and had lived in Black Pine Gap his entire life. When I brought up Old Widow Road, he became unusually quiet. Then he asked a question. "What time were you there?" I told him around 3 in the afternoon. He nodded. "That's fine." I asked what he meant. He took a sip of coffee. Then he said something I still remember, word for word. "Animals know when to leave before dark." I laughed. Harold didn't. The next day, I decided to go back. Not because I believed anything, because I wanted answers. I arrived around 6 in the evening. The sun was beginning to sink behind the western ridge. Long shadows stretched across the road. The forest felt different than it had the previous day. Quieter, not silent, just restrained, as though everything was waiting. I walked farther this time, nearly a mile. The road curved around the mountain and descended into a narrow section of valley. That was where I found the gate. An old steel gate blocked the road. It wasn't locked, but someone had painted words across it in white letters. "Turn back after sunset." The paint looked fresh, not decades old. Fresh. I stood there staring at it. Someone had gone out of their way to leave that warning. For whom? Tourists didn't come here. Hardly anyone even knew the road existed. The sun dipped lower. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. Nothing dramatic, just the sense that I should leave. So I did. I returned to my truck and drove home. That should have been the end of it. Instead, I couldn't stop thinking about the gate, the warning, the missing animal tracks. 3 nights later, I made a decision I regret to this day. I went back after dark. I parked near the entrance around 10 p.m. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to illuminate the road. I carried a flashlight, but rarely used it. The moonlight seemed sufficient. At first, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed the sound. Footsteps, not behind me, not ahead of me, off to my right. somewhere in the woods. They matched my pace exactly. Step, step, step. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. Whenever I walked, they walked. For nearly 15 minutes. I told myself it was a deer, a bear, anything rational. Then the footsteps moved closer. I could hear leaves crunching, branches shifting. Something large was paralleling me through the trees. I shined my flashlight into the woods. Nothing. The moment the beam entered the trees, the sound stopped. When I lowered it, the footsteps resumed. That was enough for me. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. Someone was standing on the road behind me, about 80 yards away, tall, thin, completely motionless. I couldn't make out details, just a silhouette. For several seconds, we stared at each other. Then the figure stepped off the pavement and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait. I headed back toward my truck, fast. The footsteps followed again, always in the woods, always matching my pace, never rushing, never falling behind, just keeping up, like an escort or a shepherd. Halfway back, I noticed something else. The forest had gone silent. No insects, no owls, nothing. Only my footsteps, and the footsteps beside me. When I finally reached my truck, I got inside and locked the doors. The relief lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then movement caught my eye. Across the road, at the tree line, the silhouette stood there again, watching. Moonlight revealed its shape more clearly. It was far taller than I first thought, at least 7 feet, maybe more. Its arms hung unnaturally long. I started the engine. The headlights flashed across the trees. The figure vanished. I drove away immediately. The next morning, I visited Harold Baker. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Then he said, "You crossed the road after dark." It wasn't a question. I admitted that I had. He sighed. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he told me the story. According to Harold, generations ago, there had been another settlement beyond the mountain. Small, remote, connected by Old Widow Road. Over time, people began disappearing while traveling between communities after sunset. Nothing dramatic. One person every few years. Then another. Then another. Never enough to create panic. Enough to create a pattern. The locals developed a rule. Travel before dark. Wait until morning. Never use the road at night. Eventually, the settlement beyond the mountain vanished. Families moved away. Buildings collapsed. But the rule remained. People stopped remembering why. They only remembered the warning. I asked Harold what he thought was out there. He shook his head. I don't think that's the right question. What is the right question? He looked toward the mountains, then answered, "Why does it stay on that road?" I never got a better explanation than that. I returned home a few days later. Life moved on. Years passed. Yet I still think about Old Widow Road, especially one detail. The footsteps never tried to catch me. Whatever was in those woods could have closed the distance easily. Instead, it simply accompanied me, as though enforcing a boundary, as though reminding me I wasn't supposed to be there. Sometimes I wonder how many old Appalachian rules began that way. Not with folklore, not with imagination, but with experience repeated often enough that entire communities learned to adapt. Don't whistle after dark. Don't answer voices from the woods. Don't use Old Widow Road at night. Maybe the reasons get forgotten. Maybe the warnings survive, because forgetting them entirely would be a mistake. Either way, I know one thing. If I ever find myself back in Black Pine Gap again, I won't be driving that road after sunset. I want to be upfront about something. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I've spent nearly 20 years working as a survey engineer. My job has taken me into abandoned mining areas, remote mountain forests, flood-damaged communities, and construction sites that most people would never willingly visit. I deal with measurements, coordinates, elevation changes, hard facts, not ghost stories, not folklore, not superstition, which is exactly why what happened in Monroe County, West Virginia, still bothers me, because I can't explain it. 3 years ago, my company won a contract involving a series of bridge inspections in remote Appalachian communities. The project was expected to take about 10 days. Because the locations were spread throughout the county, it was easier to stay locally rather than drive back and forth from the nearest city. A property manager arranged a rental cabin for me. It sat at the end of a gravel road about 20 minutes outside a community called Pine Hollow. The cabin wasn't old. It had been built sometime in the early 2000s. 2 bedrooms, small kitchen, wood stove. Nothing unusual. The nearest house was nearly half a mile away. Beyond that was nothing but mountains. The first few days were completely normal. I spent my mornings conducting inspections. My afternoons were filled with paperwork. Evenings were quiet. I would make dinner, watch television, and go to bed. The isolation was actually pleasant. After years of staying in noisy hotels, the silence felt refreshing, at least initially. On the 5th night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. No particular reason, no strange dream, no unusual sound. I simply woke up, wide awake. The cabin was completely dark, the kind of darkness you only find in remote mountain country. I glanced toward the window and immediately felt something was wrong. The motion light outside had activated. Someone was standing in the yard. At first, I thought it was a deer. Then I realized deer don't stand upright. The figure was roughly 80 feet from the cabin, tall, motionless, standing at the edge of the light. I couldn't make out details, only the outline. A person. At least I assumed it was a person. I sat up immediately. The moment I moved, the figure stepped backward, out of the light, gone. I rushed to the window. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just darkness. I waited nearly 20 minutes. Nothing returned. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a trick of light and exhaustion. I went back to sleep, or at least I tried to. The following morning, I inspected the yard. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. The ground had been damp from recent rain. If someone had been standing there, there should have been evidence. There wasn't. I shrugged it off. The human brain plays strange tricks at 2 in the morning. That explanation worked. For exactly 1 day. The next night I woke again. Same time, 2:31 a.m. I remember because I checked. This time I heard something. A knock. 3 slow knocks. Not on the front door, not on the back door, on the side wall of the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. The sound wasn't loud. It was deliberate, patient, almost polite. I sat perfectly still, waiting, listening. The knocking never repeated, but I didn't sleep for the remainder of the night. The following day, I mentioned it to a man named Curtis, who owned a hardware store in Pine Hollow. Curtis was probably in his late 60s, one of those mountain locals who seemed to know everyone. When I casually mentioned hearing someone around the cabin, his expression changed, not dramatically, just enough to notice. He asked where I was staying. I told him. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he asked, "Have you been opening the curtains at night?" I laughed. "What? "Have you been opening the curtains?" I told him yes. The cabin had large windows facing the woods. I liked looking outside while watching television. Curtis nodded slowly. Then he said something strange. "Keep them closed after dark." I asked why. He simply shrugged. "I would." That was the entire conversation, and somehow it bothered me more than if he'd told me a ghost story. That evening, I closed every curtain before sunset. Every single one. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I did it anyway. Around midnight, a storm moved across the mountains. Heavy rain, strong wind, the kind of weather that rattles windows. Eventually, I fell asleep. At exactly 2:31 a.m., I woke again. This time, there was no knocking, no motion light, no figure. For several moments, I thought maybe whatever strange pattern had been happening was finally over. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, heavy, deliberate. One side of the cabin, then the other, then back again. The sound continued for nearly 10 minutes, not running, not pacing, walking, as though someone was examining the structure, inspecting it, learning it. Every logical explanation failed. A bear would make noise differently. A fallen branch wouldn't move. The rhythm was wrong, too controlled, too intentional. Eventually, the footsteps stopped directly above my bedroom and remained there for what felt like forever. I don't know how long I stayed frozen beneath those blankets. 10 minutes, 20, maybe longer. But eventually, exhaustion won, and sometime before dawn, I fell asleep. The next morning, I climbed onto the roof. No damage, no tracks, nothing. That afternoon, I returned to Curtis's hardware store. This time, I asked direct questions. He listened quietly, then asked a question of his own. "Has it touched the cabin?" I told him no. Just noises, footsteps, knocking, the figure in the yard, nothing more. Curtis nodded. For the first time, he looked relieved. Then he told me something. A story passed through families in Pine Hollow for generations. Not about monsters, not about ghosts, about a watcher. Something that appeared around isolated homes, usually temporary homes, rental properties, vacant cabins, seasonal hunting camps, places where people stayed briefly, never permanently. The watcher never entered, never damaged anything, never harmed anyone, as far as anyone knew. It simply observed, and eventually left. I asked what it was. Curtis smiled, the kind of smile people use when they don't know the answer. Nobody ever figured that out. I drove back to the cabin feeling no better than before. Maybe worse, because now the mystery belonged to more than just me. That night was my final night before returning home. I considered getting a hotel. I probably should have. Instead, I stayed. Partly because I didn't want fear making decisions for me. Partly because I wanted answers. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke naturally, before anything happened, almost as if my body expected it. I sat in darkness, waiting, listening, watching. 2:31, nothing. 2:32, still nothing. Then a sound came from outside, a low humming, very soft, very distant. The melody was unfamiliar, but strangely calm, almost comforting. The humming slowly moved around the cabin, circling, maintaining distance, never approaching the walls, never touching the structure, just moving, patiently. Then something happened that I still struggle to describe. The humming stopped, and for the first time since arriving, I felt absolutely certain that whatever was outside knew I was awake, not suspected, not guessed, knew. The certainty arrived instantly, like stepping into cold water. Then came a single knock on the window beside my bed. Not the wall, not the roof, the glass. One knock, nothing else. I didn't look. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I didn't. Every instinct told me not to. So I stayed where I was, staring at the opposite wall, waiting. Several minutes passed. Then I heard footsteps retreating across the yard, slowly, calmly, without urgency. And for the first time in 4 nights, they never came back. The next morning, I packed my truck and left Pine Hollow. Before leaving town, I stopped at Curtis's store one final time. I told him everything, including the knock on the window. He listened carefully, then nodded, almost as if I'd confirmed something. "What does that mean?" I asked. Curtis looked out toward the mountains. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "It means it got a good look." That was all. I've never returned to Pine Hollow, never rented another isolated cabin, never left curtains open in remote mountain country. And every now and then, usually around 2:30 in the morning, I wake up for no reason. The room is quiet. The house is secure. Everything is normal. But for a few seconds after waking, I find myself listening, waiting, almost expecting to hear 3 slow knocks, or footsteps crossing a roof, or a faint humming somewhere outside the window. Because part of me still wonders whether the thing in Pine Hollow actually left, or whether it simply finished observing and moved on to somebody else. If you've spent enough time in the Appalachian Mountains, you'll hear the same warning in 100 different ways. Don't follow lights in the woods. People laugh when they hear it. I used to laugh too. That was before I spent a summer in Blackthorn Hollow, and before I saw the light that shouldn't have existed. Blackthorn Hollow sits deep in the mountains of southern West Virginia. It's the kind of place GPS barely recognizes. One road winds through the valley, passing old farmhouses, rusted mailboxes, and stretches of forest so thick they seem to swallow the sunlight. I grew up there. When I was 19, I left for college and never looked back. Or at least I thought I didn't. 10 years later, after my grandfather passed away, I returned to settle his affairs. His house sat at the edge of town, beneath a ridge covered in dense pine forest. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The porch sagged. The paint peeled from the walls. But the mountains looked exactly the same. Ancient, silent, watching. The first few days were uneventful. I sorted through boxes, cleaned rooms, and prepared the property for sale. Most evenings, I sat on the porch after sunset. There wasn't much else to do. No traffic, no city noise, just crickets and distant wind moving through the trees. On the 4th night, I noticed a light. It appeared high on the ridge behind the house, a single yellow glow. At first, I assumed it belonged to a hunter. The mountains attracted plenty of them, but the light stayed perfectly still. Hours passed. It never moved. Around midnight, it vanished. The next morning, I mentioned it to my neighbor, Earl Jenkins. Earl was in his 70s and had lived in Blackthorn Hollow his entire life. The moment I described the light, his expression changed. He looked away toward the ridge. Then he said something strange. "Don't go looking for it." I laughed. Why would I? Just don't. That was all he said. The conversation ended there. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The light returned the following night. Same location, same brightness. Again it remained visible for hours. Again it disappeared at midnight. By the 3rd night, My curiosity outweighed my common sense. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to hike up the ridge. The trail began behind my grandfather's barn. I remembered walking it as a kid. Back then, it led to an abandoned fire tower. The climb was steeper than I remembered. Darkness settled beneath the trees. Branches scraped against each other overhead. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No insects, no birds, nothing. The silence felt wrong. After 30 minutes, I reached a clearing. The light should have been nearby, but there was nothing. No camp, no lantern, no person, only trees. I checked my watch. 11:58 p.m. Then something happened. The light appeared. Not ahead of me, not above me, behind me. I turned. The glow floated between the trees, nearly 50 yards downhill. For a moment, I thought someone was carrying a lantern. Then I realized I couldn't see a person, only the light. It hung in the darkness by itself. I stared. The light remained motionless. My stomach tightened. Every instinct told me to leave. Instead, I took a step forward. The light moved, just a few feet, as if responding. I stopped. It stopped. The realization hit me immediately. Whatever I was seeing wanted me to follow it. I turned around and walked back toward the trail. The light followed. Not quickly, not aggressively. It simply drifted through the trees behind me, always maintaining the same distance. I never ran so fast in my life. When I reached the house, the light vanished. The next day, I found Earl sitting outside the general store. I told him everything. He listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded. "You're lucky." Lucky. It let you leave. I asked him what he meant. Earl stared toward the mountains. Then he told me a story. Decades earlier, before I was born, several people disappeared near the ridge. Hunters, hikers, locals who knew those woods their entire lives. Most were never found. Those who were found had wandered miles from where they vanished. Some were injured. Some couldn't explain what happened. All described seeing a light. According to local folklore, the light belonged to something older than the town itself. Something that lived in the mountains. Something that lured people away. I didn't believe the supernatural explanation, at least not then, but I couldn't explain what I'd seen. That night, I locked every door and stayed inside. The light appeared again. This time, it wasn't on the ridge. It stood at the edge of the backyard, just beyond the fence, watching. I closed the curtains. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, grief. There had to be a rational explanation. The following evening proved otherwise. Around 10 p.m., I heard knocking. 3 slow knocks against the front door. I checked the window. Nobody stood outside. Another 3 knocks. This time, from the side of the house. Then from the back. The sound moved around the property, always just out of sight. I grabbed a flashlight and looked through every window. Nothing. No people. No animals. Just darkness. Then I saw the light. It stood beside the barn, closer than ever. For several seconds it remained still. Then it began moving toward the house, not floating, walking. Something carried it. A shape emerged behind the glow. Tall, thin, far too tall. My flashlight beam struck it. The figure vanished instantly. The light disappeared with it. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every evening, the activity grew worse. Knocking, footsteps, the light. Always closer, always watching. On the 7th night, I woke around 2 a.m. Someone was standing on the porch. I heard the floorboards creaking. Slow footsteps, back and forth, back and forth. I looked through the window. The porch was empty. But the footsteps continued. The sound came from directly outside the glass. I kept the curtains closed until sunrise. By then, I had reached my limit. I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. Before departing, I visited Earl one final time. When I told him I was leaving, he seemed relieved. Then he gave me one final warning. Don't look back at the ridge. I almost laughed, but something in his expression stopped me. A few hours later, I loaded my truck and drove away. The road wound through the valley. Eventually, it reached a bend where the ridge became visible one last time. I remembered Earl's warning. I intended to follow it. Instead, curiosity won. I glanced into the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed dozens of lights. Not one, dozens, scattered among the trees, some near the ground, others higher up the slope, all perfectly still, watching the road, watching me leave. A cold wave passed through my body. I accelerated. The lights remained visible for several miles, only disappearing when the mountains finally vanished behind me. That was 12 years ago. I've never returned to Blackthorn Hollow. The property was sold. Earl passed away a few years later. Most people would say the story ends there. Unfortunately, it doesn't. 3 months ago, I received an email from the family who bought my grandfather's house. The message contained only one photograph. It showed the ridge behind the property at night. Dozens of yellow lights glowed among the trees. Beneath the photo was a single sentence. Have you ever seen these before? I deleted the email. I never replied, because some questions are safer unanswered, and some lights in the Appalachian Mountains are better left alone. The forest that called my name. If you've ever driven through the Appalachian Mountains at night, you know something feels different out there. Maybe it's the endless darkness. Maybe it's the fog that seems to move with a mind of its own. Or maybe it's the feeling that something is watching from between the trees. Most people laugh when they hear stories about the Appalachian Mountains, until they spend a night there. Then they stop laughing. What you're about to hear happened to a man named Eric Collins in the fall of 2019. At least, that's the name he used when he shared his story. And after hearing what happened to him, you might understand why. Because some places don't just hold secrets. Some places hunt. Eric had never believed in ghost stories. He was 42 years old, worked as a utility inspector, and spent most of his life driving through remote areas. His job often took him to isolated locations where cell service disappeared, and the nearest town might be 30 miles away. So when he received an assignment near a small Appalachian community in eastern Kentucky, he treated it like any other work trip. The town was barely visible on most maps. A handful of houses, one gas station, a church, and miles of mountains surrounding everything like walls. The locals were friendly enough, but Eric noticed something strange almost immediately. Nobody seemed comfortable talking about the woods. At first, he assumed it was just local superstition. Then, things got weirder. While checking equipment near the edge of a forest, he met an elderly man sitting on the porch of a rundown cabin. The old man watched him for several minutes before speaking. "You planning on being out there after dark?" Eric laughed. "Depends how long the inspection takes." The old man didn't smile. "Don't answer if something calls your name." Eric chuckled. "Pretty sure I'll know if someone calls me." The old man stared toward the trees. "No, you won't." Then he stood up and walked inside. Conversation over. Kind of rude, right? But later that evening, Eric found himself thinking about it. The warning, the expression on the old man's face, the way he sounded genuinely afraid. Still, he dismissed it. People everywhere had local legends, nothing unusual about that. The next morning, he headed deeper into the mountains. Several inspection points were located along old service roads winding through dense forest. The further he drove, the quieter everything became. No birds, no insects, nothing, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. Around noon, Eric stopped his truck and stepped out. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction. Towering trees blocked most of the sunlight. That's when he heard it. A whistle. Soft, distant, 3 notes, then silence. He turned around. Nobody. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest. He waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, he returned to work. But over the next hour, he heard the whistle again. Always distant. Always 3 notes. Never close enough to locate. And somehow, it seemed to be following him. Now maybe you're thinking it was a bird or another worker. That's exactly what Eric thought. At first. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the mountains. Rain started falling. Visibility dropped fast. Eric backed up and began driving back toward town. The road twisted through steep hillsides and dense woods. Rain hammered the windshield. Then his truck stalled. Just died. Right in the middle of nowhere. No signal. No houses. No traffic. Perfect. Because apparently, horror stories don't happen in parking lots. They happen when you're 40 miles from civilization. Eric tried restarting the engine. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The rain intensified. As daylight faded, the surrounding forest became a wall of black shadows. Then he heard it. Eric. A voice. Outside. Clear as day. His hands froze. The voice sounded familiar. Almost like his brother. But that wasn't possible. His brother lived hundreds of miles away. Eric. This time it came from the woods. Just beyond the road. The old man's warning slammed into his memory. Don't answer if something calls your name. A chill crawled up his spine. He stayed silent. The voice called again. Closer. Eric. Then something happened that still terrifies him years later. The voice changed. It became his mother's voice. Exactly. Every detail, every tone, every inflection. Eric's sweetheart. His heart started pounding. Because his mother had died 8 years earlier. The forest fell silent. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then movement appeared among the trees. A figure, standing motionless, watching. Too far away to identify. Too still to be normal. Eric locked the truck doors. The figure remained there. Not moving. Not approaching. Just watching. Minutes passed. Then lightning illuminated the mountains. For a split second, he saw the figure clearly, and immediately wished he hadn't. Its proportions were wrong. The arms looked too long, the shoulders bent at unnatural angles. And the face, there wasn't one, just darkness. When the lightning faded, the figure was gone, completely gone. Eric spent the next 2 hours trapped inside his truck. Rain continued pouring. Darkness swallowed everything beyond the headlights. Then the whistling returned. 3 notes. Much closer now. From somewhere behind the vehicle. The whistle moved slowly around the truck. One side, then the other. Like something circling him. Studying him. Waiting. Every instinct screamed at him not to look outside. So, naturally, he looked outside. Nothing. No movement, no figure. Just rain. But when he checked the passenger side mirror, he noticed something odd. A muddy handprint, fresh, pressed against the glass. From the outside, Eric nearly jumped out of his skin. Because he hadn't heard anyone approach. And whoever left it had done so silently. very silently. The whistling stopped. For a moment, everything became eerily calm. Then a new sound emerged. Footsteps, crunch, 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 slowly approaching through the darkness. Each step deliberate, measured, closer, closer, closer. Then they stopped directly beside the truck. Eric couldn't see anything, but something was standing there. He knew it. The feeling was overwhelming. The same feeling you get when someone is staring directly at you. Except this felt worse. Predatory. The driver's side window fogged slightly, and through the condensation, words appeared, as if traced by a finger. "Look at me." Eric later said that was the moment he genuinely believed he was going to die. Then, without warning, the truck engine started, by itself. No key, no ignition, just started. The headlights flashed, and for a split second, something stood directly in front of the vehicle. Tall, thin, wrong. Then it vanished. Eric slammed the truck into gear and sped down the mountain road. Branches scraped against the sides. Rain blurred his vision. But he didn't care. He just wanted distance. Lots of distance. After nearly 20 minutes of driving, he finally reached down. Safe, or so he thought. He checked into a motel, locked the door, closed the curtains, and convinced himself the nightmare was over. At around 3 in the morning, he woke to a soft whistle outside his room. 3 notes, the same whistle. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he approached the window. The parking lot was empty, except for one figure standing beneath a streetlight, watching his room. The figure remained perfectly still. Eric called the front desk. The clerk answered immediately. Before Eric could explain, the clerk interrupted him. "Don't look at it." Silence. "What?" "Close the curtain." The clerk sounded terrified. "Now." Eric obeyed. The figure remained outside until sunrise. When morning finally arrived, it was gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. Eric checked out immediately. Before leaving town, he stopped at the gas station. The cashier listened quietly as Eric described everything. When he finished, the woman simply nodded. Then she said something he has never forgotten. "It followed you because you heard it." Eric asked what it was. The woman shrugged. "No one knows." Then she leaned closer. "But when it learns your voice..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Eric left the mountains that day and never returned. Months passed, then years. Nothing unusual happened. Life went back to normal. Eventually, he convinced himself it was over. Until one night, 3 years later, he was sitting alone in his living room, watching television, hundreds of miles away from Appalachia, far from the mountains, far from the forest. Then he heard it, outside his house. 3 soft notes, the whistle, the exact same whistle. Eric rushed to the window. Nobody was there. No movement, no shadows, nothing. But on the glass, a muddy handprint slowly slid downward from the top corner, as though something had been hanging upside down above the window, watching him, waiting. And according to Eric, the whistle still returns. Not every night, not every month, just often enough to remind him. Whatever called his name in those mountains never really left. Maybe that's why Appalachian legends endure. Not because people believe them, but because people experience them. And sometimes, the mountains don't keep what belongs to them. Sometimes, they let it follow you home. If this story kept you looking over your shoulder tonight, make sure you watch the next nightmare on this channel. There's another Appalachian encounter waiting for you there. And trust me, it gets even darker.